Hello, my name is Matt Skinner. I serve as the Scholar for Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. This is another installment in our summer series called Big Questions for a Changing Church. Both the COVID-19 pandemic and also a renewed imperative to confront systemic racism in our culture are changing the ways in which people are perceiving God, the church, and the church's work in the world. And so weekly, I'm visiting with a different theological thinker who will share their perspectives on ways that congregations can change creatively, think differently, nourish themselves spiritually, and also accompany their neighbors more generously. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Carmen M. Nanko-Fernández, who is the professor of Hispanic theology and ministry at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She is also the director of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program at CTU. In addition to that academic position, she also coordinates and edits and writes the Theology and La Plaza column each month for National Catholic Reporter. She has written a lot of essays, a couple of books. One of those books is called Theologizing en Spanglish. And she's currently at work on a couple of books, one of which is El Santo, Baseball and the Canonization of Roberto Clemente, which is, we'll talk about baseball some, I am sure. But thank you, Carmen, for being here with us today and for sharing your insights with the people of my congregation.
Thanks, Matt. It's a privilege to be with you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for the conversation. I'm excited what I'm going to learn. Maybe we can start by talking about your work. Not everybody might be familiar with that expression, Hispanic theology. Can you describe a little bit about what that is, or can you describe what's distinctive about that way of doing theology or thinking theologically?
Sure. Hispanic theology is pretty much a rise back around 1980. And so it's been around for, 40, 50 years almost. And they begin with folks who are Latinos, Hispanics, folks who fall under that kind of broader umbrella, who self-identify in that way and are doing their theologizing and their ministry within the context of the United States. So it arises in that sense. So it's older than people imagine. Some put it as part of the sort of cohort of contextual theologies that come about that invite people to take seriously the contexts and the lived experiences out of which they arise. And sometimes you'll hear the term Latino theologies, Latina, more recently Latinx or Latinx, the way you pronounce the X in Spanish. Various names, because part of the premise of Latino theologizing is the notion that we have the ability to name ourselves, and that's an important piece of socially locating and situating who the theologian is in relationship to their communities of accountability, as well as to what it is that they're exploring. Some of the ways it might be that I guess you could say would be maybe characteristic would be that that taken seriously as a locus theologicus or a ground and source for doing theology is what we call lo cotidiano, which is lived daily experience. And that's why if you say that lived daily experience is a grounds and a source for theologizing, then anything is fair game, whether that's, popular religion or popular culture, justice issues, all of it is fair game for doing theology. Part of it also relies on interdisciplinary relationships, so that it's a type of theologizing that understands that it arises from particularities and needs interdisciplinary partners in order to do its analysis and to be engaged in what we call to be done en conjunto and de conjunto. In other words, in conversation with others. So it's not ivory tower in that sense. It's not a theologian talking to themselves or gazing at their navels. So it's grounded in just lived realities and real communities.
So it sounds like it breaks down that secular sacred divide that we sometimes imagine exists, right? That everything has the potential to reflect the sacred. There is no.
Right, yeah, the lines are definitely blurred in terms of making distinctions. between sacred and secular. And that also has sort of, ancient cultural roots as well. And part of it too arises from the rootedness of a lot of Latinidad in its earliest times in Catholicism as well. Sort of that sacramental imagination piece.
Yeah. I'm old enough to remember when I was in seminary that we would be taught things like, well, this is what Black theologians believe, and this is what Hispanic theologians believe, but we're doing just theology here, But one of the things that's been more helpful for me in recent years was to realize that there is no pure theology. Right? I do probably a form of white theology, or definitely a form of white male middle class theology.
Minnesota theology.
Well, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I'm a transplant. I'm not really from here, but I've been here a long time.
Yeah. No, that's funny that you say that, because at least in Latino theologies, when people say to me, well, what are you? I'd say I'm an urbano theologian. And I go, what does that mean? I said, I'm Hispanic from a city. I'm from New York, and the Bronx never leaves how I do theologies. And that's, I think, a gift of Latino theologizing that actually comes too from some of the Latino biblical scholars like Jean-Pierre Ruiz and Fernando Segovia, who tell us to take seriously the location, not just of texts, but of the people who create texts and the people who are sitting with and before and traveling with texts in these times, and interpreting. So interpreters are located and contextualized, and that impacts as well.
So I heard a lecture that you gave recently online, and you said that your social location was baseball, yeah. Which I loved. And you've written a lot about baseball, a lot of essays. You're writing this book on Clemente, which would be good to hear about. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, how does baseball become the setting that shapes your theological thinking, or what does that look like for you?
Well, I guess we go back to what socially locates us. And part of growing up, I associate baseball with Yankee Stadium because my aunt used to work there back before they, were in the in-between days, before in between victories, which there was a dry period after Mickey Mantle. So we grew up at Yankee Stadium because it was a free place for my mom to take us for the summer because my aunt worked there. So we used to get to sit in what was the press booth, which was not at all glamorous like it is today. It was just a bunch of chairs in this little box. And so we pack up sandwiches, get on the train, and go with mom, the four of us, to the baseball park to watch the Yankees and visit our aunt who worked there. So baseball was associated with family and family gatherings and playing ball in front of the house and, getting a glove from my dad. And so baseball was kind of shaping part of the worldview of growing up, playing it, being it as a fan. And which is kind of funny when people try to understand, for example, Pope Francis. If you want to understand Pope Francis, you need to understand he's a soccer fan. And he's a soccer fan at the local level, just like I would be a baseball person at the local level as well. And he has this great line where he talks about that soccer shaped his identity and in a certain way. And it does, I would understand that sort of sentiment in a similar fashion, that it shapes everything from our vocabulary to how we move in the world and how we imagine things too. And so as a Latino theologian, it's not a problem because since, daily lived experience is the ground of theologizing, for me, Latinos had spent a lot of time focusing on popular religion and as a site for theologizing. And I kind of pushed us now too in the direction of popular culture through, for example, the lens of baseball and baseball.
Mm-hmm. So what is it about, say a little bit more about how baseball fits in American culture? I know there is no one such thing as American culture, but it's a sport. It's also got this nationalist kind of ethos about it. It's also a business, of course, even more so now than it probably when you were growing up, running around Yankee Stadium. I mean, so it's say more about how that informs our sense of who we are and maybe how you think religiously or how you think spiritually.
Well, I guess I even push it even further because I say it's how fascinating that in the US we think of baseball as ours and ignore the fact that it's really very much a continental or hemispheric game that was as much shaped by the ball players of Latin America and then later by ball players from Asia, particularly China and Japan and
Korea.
Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So we might want to fix that part out, but yeah. So it was shaped by Asian ball players and also from Latin America. And in fact, in baseball terms, the Cubans are considered the apostles of baseball, and they're actually called that, the apostles of baseball, with reference to Latin America. And part of what intrigues me about that is because when we talk about baseball and we talk about race, baseball is sort of like the U.S. parable on racism in so many ways. And what people don't pay attention to is that race was a far more complicated in Latin America. And that on Latin American teams, long before 1947, ball players of all hues and of all races were playing together on teams. And then they'd go home and play on, segregated teams in the United States. So that even it complicates. So if you look at baseball beyond the U.S. context, it complicates a lot of what we think of the sport as defining what it means to be a U.S. American. On the other hand, I think part of what happens with baseball too is it comes along at a time when the United States is in its empire mood, and it's along with business and with democracy. You have baseball coming along as part of the package, and with that package also comes various denominations of Christianity that back then would have been understood as Protestant Christianities, spread with baseball and with the U.S. imperial sort of outreach, to give it a polite term, or colonization. And now we forget those stories. And then when we look at baseball too, we're looking in many ways a mirror of daily lived experience. We're talking about migrations and immigrations and, labor that is pretty much disposable when you look at what happens, for example, in the minor leagues. So I guess I look at that and say it's very much it is daily lived experience that reflects much of what else happens in our society. And while it's entertainment and business, for some folks, it's also, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's a ticket out of poverty for families. And it's, it's putting meat and food on the table for some. So, so I think in that sense, it's more complicated, and that's why I pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. Also, in terms of like Clemente, the whole issue of how somebody gets sanctified. How does a popular saint arise? Gives you an insight into even how we make saints in our respective traditions.
Let me follow up with that. So is Clemente still so popular today? You might even explain who he was. Some people might not even know the name, but is he so popular today because he died and how he died, or is he so popular today because had he lived a little longer, he might have been one of the top 10, 15, 20 players to ever to play the game, or maybe even higher than that? I mean, what do you?
That's actually a great and complicated question. Roberto Clemente is really part of that wave of early Afro-Latino players who helped to integrate the sport. But most don't realize that there were more players that were Black players who integrate the sport. Everybody just, in the national narrative, it goes, it's Jackie Robinson. And so what winds up happening is few realize how much sort of suffering those early Black players experienced through the late 40s and into the 50s, when you think about how Boston doesn't integrate to like 1959. So he's part of that wave who experiences a lot because of the color of his skin. He plays with his entire life with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and comes to the Pirates when they're sort of struggling as part of their first World Series team, like around 1960, and then again in the team that wins in 71. By that time, he's a senior person. He dies at the age of 38, delivering supplies on New Year's Eve to Nicaragua after an earthquake strikes Managua. So now he becomes on his last at bat, basically, in the regular season. He becomes one of the few at that time that had 3,000 hits, and his 3,000th hit is at his last game. He plays a couple of games after that in playoffs, but they don't get very far, so no one really pays attention after that last game. And then he dies, tragically in an accident. So my sense is that Clemente's life and all the grief that he puts up with after the sort of tragedy of a ball player dying, really at a high point in his career, soon to be retired, but still has a few playing days left in him. And then the guilt, I think, that the press experienced for all the grief that they had given him in writing over the years, creates a look back at Clemente through the lens of his sacrificial act. And that in that process, his baseball career gets re-examined and looked at in a more positive way than it probably had been during his career. And what also comes to light are some of the things that he had done, sort of like the messianic secret. Jesus went around doing good and then saying, please don't tell anybody. Clemente sort of went around and did the same thing. He'd visit hospitals, he'd help out kids and families, and then he'd tell people, don't say anything. So some of that came up afterwards. And I think that's what you have. He's at this curious intersection of baseball and race, and then also being slammed down because of the linguistic issue. And as a Puerto Rican, the whole experience of colonization and the relationship of Puerto Rico to the United States. So he's at the intersection of all of this, and his death just provides this sort of focal point that everything that gets looked back upon.
Yeah.
And the first thing they do, Major League Baseball does, is names the award that goes to ball players who do community service after Clemente. So then, even in popular imagination, he becomes forever connected to doing good works, being a humanitarian.
I'm not sure we live in an age with a lot of heroes. We certainly don't find a lot of them in the church or in politics for most people, even in business maybe, but they sure are. We still have a lot of heroes in sports. You're in Chicago, right? You
heroes and goats.
Probably see Michael Jordan's face still on advertising there, but we have heroes in sports. What does that mean, like, for the church? I mean, some of those people are heroes because they're really good at what they do. Some of those people we turn into heroes or saint-like figures because they're good, or they're outspoken, or what does that say anything about our society or about the church's role in society? Or
well, I think today it says something about celebrity and how we confuse, how heroism and celebrity sort of get conflated, and at least it feels that way today. I also wonder why should somebody who's a ball player be made a hero for doing their job at some level, and then some ball players are not allowed to misbehave. So if you look at especially Latino ball players, when they misbehave, they're held up against the standard of Clemente. When an African-American player doesn't want to speak up, he's held against, Jackie Robinson, at least in baseball. And you turn around and you're just like, what makes folks do it? And then when somebody, say, for example, Colin Kaepernick takes a stand, not only is his message twisted about to something he never even said, but it winds up making him pretty much untouchable. Even today, and as he's become a national symbol for being anti-American, which is not at all what his movement started out or ever intended to be. And it wasn't even a movement. It was a human being responding to a situation, curiously fueled by what had happened in Minnesota. That was sort of like the last straw, what had happened with Philandro Castillo. So
I think it's a great point that there's this double standard for a lot of athletes, and then to whom are they compared, right? Why can't you be more like so-and-so? And the ways that we do that are fascinating, and probably also filters down into more local things and how churches work and how communities work and who gets the benefit of the doubt and who does not. And,
right.
As part of a way in which racism gets manifested, right? Or these unjust expectations get lived out. What about, is baseball a tool for social change in this country toward justice? everybody's, at least, well, in my circle, I know a lot of people who are very excited about the way the NBA has restarted right now with
In the bubble.
lots of, yeah, they're in the bubble, but they have slogans, right? They've got Black Lives Matter painted on the court. You've got athletes who are not just willing to, but even encouraged to make public statements in a way that they're not so much in professional football or baseball. But I'm just curious, as you look at sport in this culture, can it assist the slow walk toward justice, or is it a distraction because it's mostly about celebrity and escapism? Or
I think it holds even more is even more complicated, because I think that sometimes, for example, baseball has long held itself, Major League Baseball has long held itself up as the great arbiter in brokering racism and moving towards integration. But at the same time, what isn't paid attention to is that baseball also pushed a gradualist approach. It took 12 years to just get one person of African descent, African American, a Black descent from the Caribbean, on every single team. It takes all that time. So it's this whole notion of gradualism, and also what was seen in what happened with Jackie Robinson and was expected of many Black players, is that you had to take the abuse, and in order for white folk to come along and get with the program. And because you couldn't push things into people's faces. I mean, that was sort of what was used. So baseball likes to think of itself as that, but then it doesn't pay attention to these other dimensions. So one sort of creation narrative gets, or mythology gets pushed along as the preferred narrative. And I think the same thing, even when you're looking at all of the sports, they all have there's always a preferred narrative of how they are, what's the word I want? Agents for social change. But in some ways, I think they're just following along, because they're doing something because ultimately it's a good business decision to make. Whether that business decision was to start singing the national anthem during wartime, in order to prove that, that in World War I, that Major League Baseball wasn't trying to get out of its responsibilities, or if it's now embracing what should have been embraced all along, the fact that athletes can express themselves in their workplace or in their workspace. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't come without consequences. We can all express ourselves in our workplace, but it also comes with consequences. So I guess sometimes I think that sport participates in these change movements, but to say that it's a leader, I think sports, at least organized sport, has always preferred the status quo, because it follows the money.
Right.
To blatantly just borrow a line.
like most things.
Well,
I have one more baseball question, then I'm going to change the topic. And that is, how and when this year will the New York Yankees break the hearts of Minnesota Twins fans?
I don't know, because right now the Yankees are going through this whole rash of folks being hurt.
Yeah.
And in the new configuration of what constitutes your home league being regional now, I'm not sure that we'll ever get the chance to break each other's hearts, to be honest, because I don't know what it's going to look like. And I'm also not really sure if we're going to make it to 60 games. Some of the issues that have come up even with football today, in terms of testing and which labs now are not proving to be reliable in terms of information. And, baseball was even contemplating, should it go towards the NBA bubble model? And the bubble models also raise some interesting questions about how do we create a cast of people who are basically professional entertainers who we can keep locked up, separated from their families in order to make money. And that just has, even if you're well paid, that still has parallels with too many other sorts of labor that folks have endured. And I think it raises, ethical questions that not just sport, but all of us have to sort of to think more carefully about, just so we can be entertained in the land of bread and circuses. So I think there's a lot of ethical questions that are going to have to be entertained after these seasons, if they make it to their championships with the asterisk.
Right. Even that choice of term bubble is so interesting to me. It's it's a polite term. It's who wouldn't want to live in a bubble, you know, and but there's security around that bubble, right? There's people guarding the boundaries in and out.
That's right. And then of what you give up to be in the bubble, and the kinds of relationships and with family, and, you know, all sorts of things that I think, okay, you can say a shortened season, maybe you can handle it, but and basketball had the ability to do that far more easily than baseball could.
Right.
You know, baseball's dream of playing in Florida and Arizona, and like, okay, let's look at the COVID numbers now and see how that was not a really good dream.
Right.
But, so I don't know. I think there's lots to be learned from these experiences. My bigger concern is, will we learn them, or will we just find more classes of people to consider commodities to exist for our entertainment? That's, I guess, my concern.
Well, that ties in, I think, to the question where I wanted to go, and I wanted to talk more about the pandemic in terms of what is that exposing in society right now. You've talked a bit about popular culture and day-to-day living, and there's certainly things there, but what when it comes to the church's own role in the world, the church trying to pursue justice and trying to be a community that's in the world and serving our neighbors, what do you see being exposed through the pandemic? You know, beyond some of the obvious things in terms of the statistics that are exposing all kinds of embedded racism and access to health care and well-being, the things that you see as you think about, well, Christians, churches, congregations trying to navigate their way in this.
I guess I see different kinds of trends, and I don't want to, I'm not speaking broadly across Christianity, but in terms even of more in terms of even the tradition. I come out of the Roman Catholic tradition. There's one trend that I would say is disconcerting, which is this whole notion of a return to something that we call normalcy, and what that looks like, and that a return to something is not also being accompanied by the deep questions we need to be asking about what we considered normative before. So I think that's one concern. The second is a theological anthropological issue, theological anthropology, that somehow we have fallen into the trap of thinking that these encounters we're having right now, you know, the privilege to be with you from, you know, a couple of states away, the privilege to encounter your community, that somehow we don't think of that as real, and that the virtual is not the real. And it almost calls for a new way for us to conceptualize what does it mean to be human. And now in the ages of which, you know, virtual reality, how does virtual reality fit in as a dimension of our humanity? And then that's also related to then how do we understand community in times when perhaps social distance is what it means to love your neighbor, because you care enough about your neighbor to mask and to socially distant. And I don't know that we've given the thought of how does that make, what does that mean to be human, and what about that means, how does it make me more in touch with how I understand myself as a Christian, or in my case as a Catholic Christian. And I just think this whole kind of return thing, that there's almost a magical thinking that everything's going to go back, and whether that vaccine is next week or 2 years from now. And I guess I would have liked to have seen us being more creative and imaginative at all levels in our religious institutions and educational institutions, to think of what does that mean, and how do we build community. I think of my grandparents, they were immigrants on all sides of the family, and they left young enough in their lives to know that they would probably never see their parents again. And I think, well, how did they keep ties? And then I think, you know, when my niece went away, the youngest in our family went away to college last year, and she was with my brother and I, her father, we were talking about how we lived for the phone calls from our parents, that once a week on the dormitory, you know, at the end of the hall, and you'd race down, and 10 o'clock was your time, and God forbid if anybody else was on the phone. And she said, you know, how hard that must have been. And I said, yeah, but those phone calls weren't fake. They made our parents real to us. Just like my brother and his wife FaceTiming their two kids at college, those kids are real to them. So we need to rethink what that means. Just like, Zoom and asynchronous learning are not fake learning. They're true examples and expressions of our humanity and our creativity and our possibilities to try to be with each other and support each other in very difficult times. How do we now perhaps think about that theologically about what that means? And I don't see us giving enough time to that. What also, the whole notion of who the pandemic hits has certainly caused disproportionately hit communities, certainly Latino communities, African American communities, poor communities. Peoples with disabilities are going through a really tough time right now. And yet, how has that caused us to think about the disposability of life? There's still, we should still be very haunted by, by the notion of our elders can be sacrificed for the economy. And it's like, I don't know how many elders they interviewed on that one. Let alone, you had sort of tweets of kids going, my grandma is not needed for your economy. But so I think these are sorts of on the ground things that we're not paying attention to because we're talking about what normal is. Well, normal is giving us disproportionate amount of folks from underrepresented communities being hit hard. It's giving us, well, grandma is disposable, and it's giving us that our engagement right now is not real. And so maybe normal's not such a good thing. And I guess those are kinds of the things I think about that maybe our communities, our theologians, our ministers can sort of entertain.
Are there things about this way of communicating, and especially again in church circles where we think about building community? We might also talk about sacraments and what does it mean to share together in these moments of corporate worship and belonging. And are we missing? Is there something that we just simply can't replace and we just have to wait it out? Or do you think that this kind of connecting, this kind of digital being together, if we keep working these questions through, we might figure something out? I mean, some churches are doing communion online. That means different things to different Christian communities, I realize. And it's not the same. My church is wondering, can we do baptisms? What would that look like? And what does it mean to gather this way and do that? Most people probably know somebody who's gotten married or been to some kind of a digital funeral as well, which it's better than nothing. I mean, is there something we're missing that when we get back to whatever the new normal is or the next stage that we'll think, oh, I missed that so much, or this is.
And again, I think it depends on different individuals. And sometimes I think that we forget that for some people, this has always been normal. Like, we talk about the normative, for us being in groups together, but that's not normal for other people for whom that's a struggle. Coming out of the Catholic tradition, the issue that you were talking about with, Eucharist or we're saying as well, we've been cut off from Eucharist. And I want to say, I just find it very coincidental that entire conversation happens or it's actually been cut short in our church, just months after the release of the Pope's response to the Amazon Synod, where the reality is that people were not experiencing access to Eucharist because of the shortage of priests, for example, because that is what at least in our Eucharistic theologies, was necessary. And so at a certain sense, some of us were saying, well, welcome to the Amazon. Welcome to the experience of other people for whom the arbiter of some of the sacraments is not a daily occurrence, let alone a weekly, monthly, or yearly. And welcome to what was the reality of the church in the Americas, for at least Catholics, for pretty much of 400 years. Circuit riders. So I guess at some level, I would hope that, at least in my community, that this would push us to be asking even more deeply some of these questions about what it means to be a sacramental church. And I raise this back as, what does it mean to be incarnational in a virtual age? And I don't know that some of us are prepared to go in those directions yet, because some of the answers might frighten us and they might be disconcerting. You know, I tend to appreciate the technology because it has made things possible and have put a face and made people visible and present to each other in a way that my grandparents never had with their own parents, because they left at a time by boat and in a way where there were no telephone calls, because they were poor, and there was maybe letters, but there were varying degrees of literacy in families too. So even letters were not possible. So I think sometimes we just get we have a lot more, and we're complaining a lot more too, as opposed to sitting and thinking, like, what do we have to be grateful about? I even think of, like, in a time of a pandemic where you can go online with your doctor. A new way of even healthcare has been rethinking what is healthcare and how can we keep people safe. So that's why I guess terms like return and normal and reopen make me nervous, because we wasted the time not thinking about other possibilities, perhaps.
Well, and what might be a pain about the healthcare thing is actually making healthcare more accessible to some too. I mean, there's actually a justice issue here for some, right, who were denied access to healthcare for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which being financial. And yeah.
And it's also pushing a question that needs to be pushed and really hasn't been, is that technology really should be more accessible everywhere. Rural counties should not be left out. So, it's kind of pushing, and I wish the technology folk would sort of, what's pressing them into service in terms of making, because it can make accessible all sorts of things. Online school's not new. It's over 20 years old. It's new for some teachers and students, but distance education has been a reality for since the beginning, pretty much the beginning of the century. So just some thoughts.
Oh yeah, good thoughts. You dangled one hook in front of me that I have to take a bite at. You said that we should have discussions about what this virtual presence means for thinking incarnationally or an incarnational theology, but you said we might be too afraid of where some of those conversations go. So
I think you hinted at it. You kind of hinted at one of them. You're talking about the sacraments or baptism, and if we're present to each other in these contexts, then what does Eucharist look like? I know for Catholics that's going to be very difficult for all kinds of reasons. That other traditions might have a greater flexibility to think creatively in ways that might stick us as Catholics. But baptism, at least our traditions, certainly Catholics have had a tradition of emergency baptisms where other people besides a priest or a deacon can baptize you. So what does it mean to baptism done virtually in a community where you're baptized by your mother or your father? What does that change it? Does it not change it? Does it, the whole notion of domestic church has really been lost. And, we went through the age of the builder parishes, at least for some of our denominations, and the big churches and the mega congregations. And I think this age is pointing us back towards the domestic church. Who are the first teachers in faith traditions? Well, it's our families. And when we're talking formation work, what happens if formation isn't aimed at like adults and children, but aimed at families? What does it start looking like when the family is like a locus of formation, for example? How does that shake up religious education, where your home and your family's formating, that's even a verb, together? What does that look like? How does that? So I think there's possibilities for our communities once we can get over once we deal with the reality that we're probably in this for at least 2 years. And that this is what is. This is nuestra cotidiano. This is our cotidianidad, our daily lived experience. This is what it is going to be.
And it's one that's stratified by race and class and other issues as well, right? I mean, getting back to accessibility and reports from so many school districts about students who can't simply get a broadband connection, right? Or there's one laptop being passed around a family of 5, 6, 7, 8 people or something like that.
And I guess I asked the question is, why weren't we working on that for the past 6 months? Okay, where were we? What did it take? Why, where were the big tech giants, and why weren't they helping us figure this out? Where are the local satellite trucks they could have sent into rural areas? Yeah. So, that's my concern, is like, did we not think? Because these issues are not new.
Right.
Access issues are not new.
Right. Well, and for a church, for any congregation, wherever it's located, that's thinking about, we miss being able to do the stuff we used to do, or we miss the kind of service projects we used to be engaged in. Thinking about these kinds of things that are more hidden to our daily vision, right? You drive past an apartment building, you can't always tell if everybody has Wi-Fi or not, but
right.
You can tell other things sometimes. But yeah, the way that opens up, how do we become more creative to find ways in which community needs to be tended and built beyond our old ways of assessing that or taking measure of that?
Yeah, like what happens when it's like we become used to giving or donating or being charitable with goods. What happens when you start reconfiguring that in an age like now, where accessibility and technology becomes something necessary to be able to participate in society, to have access to an education and to employment? How do communities think about their technological giftedness as an asset that's to be shared, and not just out of our luxury or out of our surplus? How do we reconfigure that? So yeah, I think there's areas that it opens up that again, I think we're still sort of in shock. We're sort of sitting here going, we don't know what's going on, and some of us are trying to pretend it's okay and go to restaurants and everything else, because the more normal it feels, then we'll be okay. And others are hiding, and so I think we're just all kind of dealing with the shock of this, and it has not yet worn off. And then is going to come the point where we're saying, okay, well, this is going to be. So how do we live in this moment, respond to this, and build for tomorrow, instead of bemoaning what it is that we don't have from yesterday? And I think that's a challenge. And how does that become a part of what ministers do in accompanying communities when we ourselves are sitting in states of shock?
Right. Well, and most pastors I know are tired,
exhausted,
and are trying to figure out how to make all of this run. It's just another set of plates to keep in the air.
And how does that then invite notions where the pastor is part of a network, as opposed to as the pastors are at the center? Because in education, a similar model has occurred. So faculty who are having a hard time are faculty who were lecture-based, because it was like there was a centering of a faculty person, and they were great lecturers, many were wonderful lecturers. But then the problem becomes is, well, that's not really the best way to use, for example, Zoom. All right. So what happens when the learning becomes student-driven, student-centered, student initiative, student responsibility? How does the faculty now have to re-understand themselves in that kind of an equation? And I think it's a similar one with parishes and pastors and communities and congregations. How do we as ministerial people who are so trained to do suddenly have to be sort of curators and cultivators of networks? And how does technology allow that to be a successful model, or successful paradigms that can develop out of that?
I recommend doing an interview series.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. Actually, you know what might be really cool is there's places like the Louisville Institute, for example, that give grants to pastors thinking things through with congregations. And I mean, this is sort of an ideal time to sort of for communities to think through, like, well, maybe there is some funding to help us think this through in a meaningful way in real time together. So,
right, in a way that's not just putting a patch on something, but is actually thinking into new ways of being church and new ways of being community.
Yeah, so sort of like, the earliest formations of the church, figuring out how in their different particularities across the Roman Empire, um, what was growing and happening at that time, and what did it mean to care for the communities local, but yet to be somehow connected distantly in ways that they were just only beginning to understand, or to navigate or negotiate. It's almost a time like that. Um, so I don't know, just possibilities, but I think it returns a lot to the ground. It returns a lot to local communities, um, and a reading of one's own contexts, reading of the context that one finds themselves in.
Yeah. Let's go down that road a little bit with the time that we have left. In this series throughout the summer, I've been talking mostly to Presbyterian scholars and people who teach at Presbyterian schools, not because we think we're the best, but because part of what we've been doing is examining our own practices, our own history, and figuring out what's useful, where do we need to make changes, where does repentance fit in. And you're not Presbyterian, not yet, although I hear some, you've got a populist streak going in you that I might be able to exploit. But no, I'm honestly curious that given your own identity, your education, your teaching role as a Roman Catholic, we can go even further too, as a Latina Catholic theologian who's, as you've described that, what are some of the gifts that you think your tradition has to offer the wider church right now in terms of your wisdom, your history, your practices, your point of view that can help the wider church through this time of new community and some isolation, and also through this time where, again, our reawakening to some key deadly justice issues are rightly taking a lot of our attention and making us take the topic of systemic racism more seriously. Are there some things that you think are great gifts from where you come from and where you theologize out of that you want to share?
I think they're gifts, but I don't know that we realize we have the gifts, and I'm a little pessimistic, I guess, or New York cynical, that I'm not really convinced that we've used the gifts as wisely as we could have during this time. I think the one is something I mentioned before, is this, and this is also a very Latino thing as well, is sort of a privileging of an incarnational theology. And I think that gives us an opportunity to, what I was speaking about before, to think through what is this new dimension of our humanity when we think of our virtual beings in light of what does that say incarnationally. And I think there's it's a gift that needs to be unwrapped even and taken more seriously, as I think we're going to be in this for a while, and I think that a lot is going to be changed after this time. So I think that's one. This is this sort of appreciation for the incarnational nature of theology.
Can you say a little more about that? Can I interrupt you there before you get to number two and say a little more about this incarnational nature of theology? Is that a respect for human bodies and human experience?
It's the embodiedness, the location, the particularity of being human, that is not thought of in abstract terms. And then how does that cause us then to think of what's possible? So, and in this, I think we've thought a lot about what it means in other dimensions, but we have not exploited or explored what does that mean for us in these ages of virtual relationships? And what does it mean to be present virtually? And how is this a form of embodiment, and what does that mean? And if you want to go to the what would Jesus do sort of dimension of it all too, is we really should be asking ourselves is, how would Jesus have it, have dealt as a virtual incarnational presence, if this was the time that Jesus is born into. I think it also causes us that I think we've been so focused on what it is we have lost or what we miss, that we're not seeing the incarnation in what's going in the people who are suffering outside, in the frontline workers, in our own families, in those of us who are sick or fear being sick, or all the issues of, again, another African American shot in the back in front of his children. We need to be thinking, what does this mean, and how has our virtual dimension made these things real to us, and in a way that would not have been possible. So I think the incarnational piece is something that's a gift that needs to be more richly explored in light of this other dimension of what is made possible because of our technologies. The second thing I would say too, in terms of Catholicism, is this privileging of a sacramental imagination. So in other words, the ability to see the presence of God in all sorts of places and things. And so you can have in Catholicism a respect for creation as a site of revelation. For example, God makes the divine presence known in the sunset and the sunrise. God suffers with the land when the land hurts. So I think there's that sort of a sacramental imagination that if we more deeply kind of tap into that might also give us ways of thinking and acting and reacting and interacting our way through these times into possibly creating better times. The third is this notion of accompaniment. It's a big theme certainly for Francis, but it's not a new one. And I look to back in several centuries ago, Catholics had a sense of accompanying its immigrants. So for example, some of the earliest ministries in 1800s and early 1900s were when immigrants came, religious congregations came with them. In other words, preordained men, sisters, they opened schools, they dealt in the language, they provided, because providing ministry and care and being where people were at has always been this streak that has existed. It doesn't always get paid attention to, but it's existed. And so I think that we need to be asking ourselves is how now do we accompany our communities in this other sort of time where time and space and distance are almost collapsed when our congregations expand. What might that look like? Is that a gift that we've had in our tradition that we can pay attention to? And then I also think something that's part of our tradition in these times that needs to be explored and taken seriously is the examination of conscience. And these times have definitely caused us to be raising questions about where our communities have perhaps been good, but where we have not been so good on issues of disparity, of racism, xenophobia, and how we've helped to exacerbate things, and also in terms of care of creation and how we look at those who are suffering in terms of how we regard even illness or the health of the body. So it's like, I think this, this quiet time too, in some senses, calls us to start examining these areas that we haven't had the times, perhaps, to think through more seriously. So I guess those are some sort of gifts I would see in Catholicism that other Christian traditions share too, but they certainly have, been at the forefront. And a number of them also would be parts of what Latino theologizing brings to the equation as well.
That's a great list. It's a big list, and I like that each one is a gift, but also has some baggage, right? In terms of how has it not been utilized. I appreciate that you phrased it all like that. Can I ask a follow-up question really quickly on the third one? You used the accompaniment. Like, how many did I do? I think it was the third. You used the language of accompany. Mm-hmm. You didn't say like chaperone or steward or guide. Accompaniment seems a better word. Can you say a little more about that? That it's walking with as opposed to leading by the hand or carrying or.
Yeah, it's not carrying. It's not running ahead of. It's also not stealing somebody else's shoes. So sometimes people walk in your shoes and they take off with them. And I think that happens sometimes, and it's well intentioned. But when you have, especially with communities that are not your community, like Latino communities being accompanied by say for example white pastors or white ministers, that sometimes you can become so identified with the community, but to the point that you become their arbiter, their interpreter, their translator. But the community never needed you to be those things. So that's what I mean by, walking off in somebody's shoes, is that, I tried them on, oh, you're suffering, and now I can speak for you, sort of situation. So I think that that's not accompaniment, but I think it's a temptation to well-intentioned accompaniment. It was Sharon Ringay, who's a biblical scholar. She does a lot of work with us Latino communities and Central American communities. And she said the word is a lot better in Spanish, because if you look at it in Spanish, acompañamiento, that at the heart of the word is the word for bread. And that in effect, that accompaniment means that one is sharing one's bread with another, which implies also the time it takes to eat and share that bread, the time it takes to be in a relationship, the time and energy and the slow development of trust that it also takes. So accompaniment, I think, is far more difficult, because you go in, you can't go in with the expert mentality, but rather that this is a community that you are now a part of, and you share a road. And as ministers, sometimes, depending on our traditions, we may only share a road for a little while. Same thing in education. They're transitory communities in the sense, like schools, in for 3 years, in for 8 years, in for 4, and then out. So how for whatever given time, how does one learn the context one's in, avoid the temptation to always compare to wherever I was last, and to sort of grow in new ways with the particular community, its context, its needs, and the places where communities we need to challenge ourselves to, where we're lacking, where we need to sort of prophetically pay our attention to, which I think is another benefit of the virtual, is that while it certainly helps us to connect locally, it has the ability to put us in touch with worlds that we could never travel to, especially if we're financially limited or have other, now, can't even get on an airplane now. So, but, so how do these things play into accompanying or being with, or to borrow from, I think, Sharon's insight, to share bread in mutual and meaningful ways?
Well, that's my one regret, Carmen, that we couldn't share bread, and it would have been great to have this conversation over a meal at a table somewhere and to meet face to face. But I am really grateful that we connected virtually, which is still real, as you reminded us.
I never would have met you otherwise, Matt, or had the opportunity to be with your community. So exactly. Shout out to your community, and thanks for letting me into your living rooms and your kitchens.
Well, you're welcome. And of course, their engagement with you is real too. So I'm going to thank you on their behalf and tell you to keep healthy, and good luck to your Yankees in whatever kind of season this turns out to be.
That's right. And if we meet with Minnesota, whatever that looks like.
We'll see what happens. My hometown Giants will probably not be there. So
Okay, which Giants? The New York Giants or the San Francisco Giants?
I'm of the age where they were always the San Francisco Giants. But
okay. Well, New York never forgets. They're always the New York Giants.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you, Carmen.
It was a pleasure, Matt. You be safe and healthy, and your community too.
Thank you.